All right, everyone, let's go ahead and dive into Lecture 4. What we are going to focus on now are some of the other consequences of the Industrial Revolution. So over time, as a society, we started to become more and more industrialized. So this meant that more factories were creeping up and more urban development was happening, and we started to have more regular transportation like trains and highways. Agriculture, again, just got more and more sophisticated. We started mining, which we desperately needed to do, and then we had to meet our energy needs because, of course, factories run on energy, and so we had to find a way to be able to power them and so forth. And so, as you can imagine, I'd like you to take a minute now, pause lecture, okay, and think about how is this going to all impact the environment, okay? So what is this going to do from the environmental perspective, and how are we changing the trajectory of so many other species that we've kind of been thinking about? So one way you might be able to think about the ways that the Industrial Revolution impacted nature was through pollution. Okay, so realistically speaking, a lot of factories do produce pollution. And so this has sort of been a battle that's been going on as long as factories have been around. So, they tend to give off waste. They have no place to put it. Back in the day, they used to just release it into the rivers, and then it would go downstream. And you can imagine what a disaster that was from the environmental perspective, because a lot of this is what we're talking about is toxic chemicals. So none of that is actually good for the environment. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh, I'm sure this is a long ways away from me. It doesn't really impact me. And I would say not necessarily so. I can tell you in Ypsilanti, which is not far from us, there is an old Ford plant that was started by Henry Ford. And I can tell you from experience that Henry Ford built a dam so he could power his plant. And so he put up a dam and then used electricity from that dam to actually give his plant the power it needed. Now the problem was, though, and I'm fairly certain of this, is that the Ford plant also dumped a lot of waste in the lake, okay, that they happened to create. And I can tell you this from a personal perspective because I used to let my dog go swimming in this particular lake when we first got here 10 years ago. And then I started to see, though, as she was stepping through all the sediments, all of the grossness that was popping up, and it didn't look natural. And so after a while, I did a bit of research, and they didn't really admit to a lot, but I suspect that a lot of garbage was dumped in there because those deeper sediments that were buried that she was kicking up, nothing about them looks natural. So you always want to be careful next to an industrial site because really you never know the history of what was there and what happened to the environment. Now the good news is the impacts of the factory pollution doesn't necessarily have to be permanent. You may or may not have heard about kettlewells moths, otherwise known as spiced and ventilaria, that existed in England back in the day. Basically, there were two morphs of these moths that were found. One was a light morph and one was a dark morph. And back in the day, before coal was being used as a power source in England, the dark morph was the one to often get spotted and eaten by predators, and the light morph often got away. Well, eventually what happened is they started to burn coal. A lot of soot went to the trees. And then the dark morph was much better hidden, as you can see on the right. And the lighter morph became the target of the predators. Well, over time, though, England stopped using coal as a power source, and the trees went back how you saw on the left. Okay, fortunately, there were still two morphs around, and the lighter morph became more frequent again. And that was a good sign for the environment. So it's not as if the impacts of pollution will last forever, but we do just have to get them under control because that's a big consideration when you're dealing with nature and, the impacts of the Industrial Revolution. Okay, so another problem is known as urban runoff, okay? And so we have this issue in Ann Arbor. And I can't think of a better example than when my husband and I used to go swimming in the river next to Ann Arbor. And back when we were younger, I'll admit we were younger back then, we would go tubing down the Huron River, okay? And I remember we'd go a lot during the summertime, and it was always a lot of fun. I highly recommend it, by the way. But I have one suggestion for you. Do not go right after a rain, because everything, the oils and grossness and all of that that's in the city runs straight to the river. So my husband and I went one time, and only one time, right after a rain, and we both felt so slimy and so gross after we got out of the river that we decided we were never doing that again. The reason is because there is no, in areas where you have a lot of concrete, there's nowhere for that water to go have all the gross things filtered out of it. Whereas if you look to the right, and you get a lot of water that actually gets filtered out by the vegetation, it's much better in the long run because that doesn't go straight to the rivers, okay? So if you want to do an experiment, it's a lot of fun in the summer, just be careful. Another great example of a species are some little killifish that are found in the Elizabeth River. So the Elizabeth River is found in Virginia, and as you can see from the picture to the right, it is incredibly polluted, okay? Not many things can live in that river, especially when it gets so polluted with chemicals and so forth. Well, there's this little fish called the killifish that you can see on the upper left that actually can, believe it or not, handle the pollution. Okay, but the interesting part of this is the fact that if you capture these little fish and you cut them open, to be perfectly honest, you will notice that their livers are riddled with tumors. Okay, so let's think about that. Why might that be the case? Well, what's the function of the liver? So the function of the liver, remember, is to be the filter. Okay, and so somehow these little fish have evolved to be able to withstand all sorts of tumors in their livers. Now that's phenomenal. Okay, however, this is called a trade-off, an evolutionary trade-off, because this didn't come without a consequence. Scientists have found if they take these little guys and they grow them elsewhere in a clean river, okay, they are very susceptible to bacteria and germs. In fact, they almost always die young. So somewhere along the evolutionary trajectory of this little fish, basically they gave up their immune system to be able to live with a bunch of tumors in their liver. And the reality is they probably didn't need an immune system in all that pollution because nothing else could live there but them. Okay, so the bacteria and so forth that would have usually caused them disease probably took a hit and they didn't have to have an immune system anymore. However, if you pull them out of that environment, they're no longer well suited to compete against everybody else and they die out. Now, the scientist in me thinks this is so cool. Okay, how awesome is that these little guys have managed to live this way? However, hopefully the river will get cleaned up eventually and won't have to look like this, and then these guys can go back and get their immune system again, someday, with any luck. Now, you can imagine that transportation also causes a lot of pollution, okay, which is going to negatively impact the environment around. Now, I remember as a kid, long, long ago, many, many decades ago, seeing trains like this that were obviously just horrible polluters, okay? But these days, thankfully, you don't see this. They're not allowed to pollute like this, which, I'm very grateful for as someone who is really fond of clean air, okay? However, realistically speaking, trains, cars, all of that does tend to leave pollution, at least until we find a way, that's better for the environment and affordable to everybody. I'm sure you can also imagine that when you create a bunch of highways that end up cutting populations down that were once very large into much smaller, isolated populations, you would lose genetic diversity. So think about the bottlenecks we talked about before. Okay, so not too long ago, researchers conducted a study on the large cats of California. And they looked to see those that had lived in areas that didn't have many highways versus those that had a lot of highways. And what they found is that the big cats were definitely losing genetic diversity. Now again, in order for them to evolve and adjust, genetic diversity is one of the most important things that they need. So ultimately, from an evolutionary perspective, this is really bad because if something happens down the line, they may not survive. And of course, who doesn't love big cats? I mean, they're awesome. They go after rodents. They keep the rodent population under control, which of course used to carry the plague and so forth. So I'm a big fan, I'll tell you. Go cats. Now, one potential solution, by the way, to having areas that become split by highways is to have land bridges. So a lot of these have been extensively used by other countries, not necessarily by us yet. I keep hoping to see more. Now, the idea with a land bridge is you create a bridge, but then you have land over the top with trees and so forth so that the critters will end up using them and not crossing the highway and becoming roadkill or becoming more isolated. So I'm hoping for more of these in the future. I know they're really expensive, but I think they're a lovely idea, and you can actually use motion-sensitive cameras and take an inventory of who's using them. So I think it's a great idea, personally. Now, we might not realize it, but we do have a lot of pollution due to agriculture, in the example of excess nitrogen. So a lot of the excess nutrients do go to the waterways. We've kind of talked about that a little bit before, and we will talk about that more later on. However, believe it or not, the wind picks up a lot of the nitrogen and carries them way far off, for example, into the mountains of Colorado and Arizona. Now, from a science perspective, this is pretty fascinating because what researchers are discovering is that areas that actually have excess nitrogen, this kind of changes the composition of the ecosystem, and plants that were once dominant because there was limited nitrogen are no longer dominant, and so the grasses and trees and so forth start to change, all because of this excess fertilizer. Okay, and those that were once dominant become more rare, and those that were once rare become more dominant. Now, does that make a big difference? Well, it does for the insects and the animals that depend on those plants. That could make a huge difference. And, once again, it kind of shows a way that humans interfering and are screwing things up. Is anybody surprised? Nah. Sorry, guys. I just have to find a way to work around it or find a way to solve this. So, lots of work for you guys to do in the future. Now, another way that humans have impacted other species is caused by pesticide resistance. So as farmers don't want pests to eat all their crops, they very often will spray toxins to try and get rid of the pests, okay? And a great example is on the left, where they have a few resistant bugs, but not many. They spray with pesticide. Those that survive because they were resistant to the pesticide will produce more offspring. And over time, you see more of those little red resistant bugs until eventually the crops are taken over by these pest resistant bugs. So this has been happening for decades, okay? And the best example I can think of now are the rats. And so rats in London have become so strong and resistant to pesticides that they can actually withstand 6 times the normal amount of pesticide that used to kill them off. Not only that, they're larger in size. Okay, not only that, now there's really no way to get rid of them, because if people use more pesticide than that, they start to hurt the humans. Okay, so the evolutionary biologist in me think this is the coolest thing ever. The human in me is terrified. Okay, these are called super rats, larger than they normally are and resistant to the pesticides. Now, I don't know if you guys were listening to the news in December, but apparently there was a Chipotle restaurant in New York City that was absolutely getting overrun with rats. Okay, so look it up. December, New York City, Chipotle. Read the articles, pause lecture. It's well worth seeing to be slightly mortified. Eventually, I was looking. It looks like the Chipotle closed because there were so many rats they'd chewed through the wiring, so they were no longer had wiring or electricity to be able to serve and ring up customers. I gotta be honest, if I saw that many rats, I wouldn't be going in there anyway, but that's just me. So that's all selection, by the way, guys. We made them more resistant to the pesticides. That's completely due to humans. So the question is now what do we do? Now, whether we realize it or not, mining for metals also leaves a really big impression on the environment. So there can be many different ways that people mine precious metals. Sometimes they will just take off the entire mountaintop, okay? Sometimes they'll dig underneath. Other times they'll have a slant mine or a shaft mine. I don't know if you guys all realize this, but there's actually a really huge salt mine located underneath Detroit. Take a second and Google this. It's actually pretty cool. It used to be that Detroit got its salt, and they sold it for table salt many, many years ago. However, I think the quality of salt, they took out all the good stuff and left some of the bad stuff, and now it's used for road salt. Okay, but go ahead and check it out. It's definitely worth it. But you can imagine that, if you have all these types of mining, okay, it's going to influence the environment, especially if you take off the mountaintop, or if you, you end up having pollution from the mines. Speaking of which, I'm going to go to the next slide because it's a great lead into it. Now, mining, especially for precious metals, very often pollutes the area around it. So, for example, if people are mining for gold, I don't know if you ever watched that Alaska Gold Rush on TV or anything like that. I'm sure it's kind of hokey, but it's interesting. However, what we may not realize is what people use to get the gold out is arsenic. Okay, and arsenic is incredibly poisonous, especially towards humans. It's toxic. Carcinogen, all sorts of other bad stuff. Now, I remember visiting my cousin out in Colorado many, many years ago, and I remember as I was visiting her, we would go driving around the area, and look at a bunch of old mines. Now, we never went in them. We just went to areas that had been mined for precious metals. And the reason I remember this so well, because it happened like 25 years ago, is because I'll never forget the water that was surface water that was running out from these mines was a neon green. Okay? Water's not naturally a neon green. There were some really, really bad toxins in there that unfortunately never got cleaned up, and once the mines went bankrupt, they just left it. Thanks a lot, guys. And whoever else happened to be in the mines. So unfortunately, those companies just left the toxins, and now the water runs off neon green. Okay, so mining, unfortunately, has a huge impact on the environment. You know, we don't often consider this, but nature does find a way, if I can use that favorite quote, because we're going to talk about in the next slide how some plants are actually able to overcome this. Once again, showing how plants are awesome, and we don't often give them as much credit as we should. So this is a really cool way that plants have sort of found a way to deal with the heavy metals and the toxins that are left from the mines. Now, all of that contaminated soil is called mine waste, okay? And so the uncontaminated soil and the mine waste can very often be right next to one another, okay, as you can see from here. Well, what scientists have discovered is that there are areas that are highly polluted and highly contaminated, and yet there are still plants growing on them and doing quite well. They also became very curious if they had truly adapted to living in the mine waste, or if it was just, you know, a gene that was flipped on and off or something like that. So in order to address this, they did this really cool experiment where they did what's called a transplant. Okay, so they took plants from the uncontaminated soil, put them on the mine waste, took those from the mine waste and put them in the uncontaminated soil. Then they let them grow, okay, and they watched over time to see what happens. So the plants from the uncontaminated soil that were planted on the mine waste died, okay, and that's kind of what you'd expect because they're not adapted to that environment. But the other interesting part is that the plants that were initially grown in the mine waste that went to the uncontaminated soil, they didn't die, but they didn't do very well. And in fact, they could not outcompete those that were naturally found in the uncontaminated soil. So this means that they actually had adapted to living in the mine waste and living with all of that, you know, poisons and toxins and so forth. However, when they're in a normal environment, they get outcompeted. Most likely, it comes at an evolutionary cost to be able to deal with all of this poisons, all these poisons and so forth, kind of like the killifish, right? They had to sacrifice something to be able to grow in that environment, but they still are growing, which is the really cool part, and they are still doing well. So you can actually say they have evolved, okay, their gene frequencies have changed through time, and they've evolved and adapted to being able to grow in heavy metal poisons and toxins, and that part's really cool. Now, as we became industrialized, we needed energy, okay, and so you can have many different types of energy that we use. Power plants, you can use coal-fired, you can use hydropower. There's all sorts of different types of energy, but nuclear used to be really popular a while ago because it seemed like a clean alternative. Well, then we started to have nuclear accidents, okay? And so I am alive and old enough to remember Chernobyl when it happened in 1986. I was young, however, I remember when it actually happened. And so basically what happened is the Chernobyl power plant was undergoing some tests, okay? And so this is in what used to be the Soviet Union, now it's the Ukraine. And they were testing their system to see how the power plant would react. Well, they did this late at night when no one was around, except for one guy with a really big ego. And he insisted the test be run. Lo and behold, there was an accident. And if you guys ever have the opportunity, I highly recommend you watch the HBO series Chernobyl. I actually have some research projects I'm starting to incorporate into my research that deal with how plants have dealt with the radiation at Chernobyl. And so this is an interesting area for me. The series was actually pretty informative. A lot of it was right. Some of it was wrong, but it was still pretty cool. Definitely, it's intense, okay? But it allows you to see mistakes that have gone wrong and why nuclear power, I'm totally biased in this, guys, but it's a bad idea, okay? So I'd love to say that nuclear power is a great source, but it's really not. There's too much human error that's involved, and if you watch this series, you know, who knows? But anyway, highly recommend it. It's pretty good. Now, I will also tell you, after Chernobyl happened, people thought that the area would be a wasteland. no plants, no animals growing, that it would just be nothingness, okay? So keep that in mind. What you may or may not realize from Chernobyl is once the explosion happened and once the government, Soviet Union, figured out what was going on, they basically told people to drop everything, get on a bus, and leave, okay? So they weren't supposed to take anything with them. They weren't supposed to even take their pets with them. How sad is that? I don't know what I would have done if I'd been alive back then. But if you go there now, it's basically looks like things are frozen in time, okay? It's very sad, it's very desolate from a human perspective, but then from a scientific perspective, it's absolutely fascinating. Because if you remember, I said that people predicted it would be a barren wasteland and nothing would ever grow. Well, let's talk about that. So what people tend to be finding out now with regards to Chernobyl and the plants and animals is that some of them have suffered due to the radiation, but some of them are doing great, okay? And this is crazy because if you remember, everybody thought this was going to be a barren wasteland, but it's not. And in fact, so many plants and animals are doing so well, they've actually turned it into a bioreserve. So now it's called the Chernobyl Bioreserve, and it's awesome because so many plants and animals do seem to be thriving here and doing pretty well. There's wild hogs, there's bears, there's dogs, there's wolves, there's all sorts of crazy creatures that are running around. Now, not everything, though, is perfect, and research at this point is a bit controversial, so keep that in the back of your mind. Now, this to me is absolutely fascinating. If you'll recall, we talked earlier about ecosystem services. One of those is decomposition, okay? So if things didn't decompose, we would be up to our necks in dead things, and that would just be gross. Okay, so decomposition is very definitely an ecosystem service that is very necessary for us to live our lives. At Chernobyl, researchers have found that decomposition seems to have stopped. Okay, so in other words, there's leaves laying on the ground that have been there since 1986. All right, that to me, from a scientific perspective, is fascinating. From a human perspective, is kind of terrifying. Okay, because what's going to happen? Is it going to stay like this? Will the nutrients ever be recycled? It's really important. That's an ecosystem service and so forth. So many things need to be answered. But again, there's the scientist in me that gets fascinated and the human in me that's slightly nervous. We'll just have to see what happens. However, it's all cool because it's all science. Just to give you an example of some species that don't seem to be doing as well, there are bird species that seem to be born with certain mutations, most likely caused by the radiation, or the species are not doing as well as they used to before the radiation was here, just based on bird surveys and so forth. There's so much research that needs to be done to really understand what's going on and how radiation is impacting all of these critters. If you guys are interested in research, this is a lovely, fascinating area. Just saying. Some of you might be saying to yourself, well, that's Chernobyl, that doesn't impact me, that's all the way over there, so why should I be worried about it? And I would say, well, first off, in the U.S., we have a lot of nuclear power plants, guys. In fact, 2 of them are down the street from us, Fermi 1 and Fermi 2, okay? Secondly, Fukushima. Yeah, happened not too long ago. Big disaster, remember this? Okay, so I just read a report not that long ago stating that Fukushima is leaking radiation much worse than was being reported, or much worse than anybody thought. This is an older figure, so I expect it should be ramped up. Okay, so where you see purple is the worst of the radiation, but you can also see it's being carried to California and Alaska and BC and all sorts of other places all the way down to South America. Anything that is carried that far is going to impact us because where do we get our fish? Well, when they're wild caught, we tend to get them from the ocean. So, now this doesn't mean everybody should panic, okay? So I'm not trying to incite that by any means. I just want you guys to be aware of what's going on in the world around us and when you should take precautions about things, okay? Some fish are wild caught, some fish aren't. Ideally, they're testing for radiation and other chemicals and so forth so they don't sell us anything that's going to make us sick. So if all goes well, everything's fine. Okay, but again, I want you to be I want you all to be aware of what's going on in the world around us and what your generation, I'm afraid, is going to have to deal with. Because my generation, well, we're trying, but we can see how well it's working. Sorry, it's the cynical part in me. All right, guys, so this is the last lecture for this week. Okay, so listen to the lectures first. Then take the quiz. You'll have tons of time. Open note, open book. You're going to be fine. Okay? If you have any questions or something's not clear, please let me know. Stay safe, everybody, and stay healthy, and I will chat with you soon. If you need anything, always let me know, okay? My door is always open. Even though I'm not physically there, I will always, find time to meet with you guys. And then someday soon, I'll get to be physically there, see you all in person, and that's going to make me so happy. Talk to you soon.